Hey y'all, it's Mr. Hill again. So in this video, we're talking about presidential nominations. And I would be talking about, like, say, the Democratic Party, primary that would have been going on even as we speak, but that kind of wrapped up much earlier than anybody anticipated, especially considering that at one point there were like nearly 30 people running for the Democratic Party nomination. So what does that even mean as far as nominating a president? That's what this video is about today. So presidential nominations, objectives. Describe the role of conventions in the presidential nominating process. Evaluate the importance of presidential primaries. Understand the caucus convention process. Outline the events that take place during a national convention, and examine the characteristics that determine who is nominated as a presidential candidate. Several key terms: presidential primary, winner take all, proportional representation, caucus convention, platform, keynote. We'll explain all that as we go through these slides. So, nominating the president. The system of nominating the president is not mentioned in the Constitution, which is weird when you think about how important the president is. There is no mechanism or no guidelines or anything in the Constitution for how to nominate a presidential candidate. It's been basically created by the two major parties. So that's part of the reason why we even have the two-party system as we know it. Because they've built up a lot of power in delivering us presidential candidates throughout the years. Each party's national committee sets the time and place of its national convention, which is where technically they get together to actually nominate their candidates. The committees also assign each state party a certain number of convention delegates. We're not going to get into all these delegates because it's a little confusing, but there are thousands of delegates for both parties, and literally, in the lead up to the national conventions, both parties conduct these primary elections where each of those candidates is trying to get as many pledged delegates as possible. And if you get over a majority of those delegates, you're going to be that nominee for that party. So as it stands today in 2020, we've got Donald Trump, who is the incumbent president. That's going to be the Republican nominee this coming November. And we've got Joe Biden, who is the last man standing out of all those 30-ish people that had decided to run for the Democratic Party nomination. Those are two candidates this coming November. So as far as selecting delegates, again, not to spend a ton of time here, the Republican Party leaves the process of picking delegates largely up to each state. The Democratic Party also enforces some national party rules to promote participation by minorities, women, and grassroots organizations. So as far as the presidential primaries themselves, the details of the delegate selection process vary from state to state. Each state does things a little different. In some states, the presidential primary chooses the party delegates to the national convention. In others, it expresses a preference among presidential contenders, and in most states, it does both. So basically, when you go and vote in your party's primary, that is the first election of the presidential election cycle. So that began this year in February. So you start the primaries in February, and they continue through like May or June. And then you get to the conventions later on. And then in November, we have the actual main event presidential election. So as far as these preference primaries, you might see a candidate's name, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, whoever it is, and those names are a stand-in for a slate of electors for that party. So or a slate of delegates, excuse me. So those delegates are all pledged to vote for that particular candidate that won. They go off to the national convention, and then they have another round of electing at the convention. And at the end of that round of voting, that's when you get your actual nominee. Obviously, at this point, we have a de facto nominee for the Democratic Party already, and that's Joe Biden. Why do we already know it's going to be Joe Biden? Because everybody else has dropped out So he's going to win by default every, primary that's left on the calendar. And then obviously the same basic story for Donald Trump as well. So as far as the primaries today, state primaries were at one point winner-take-all affairs for both parties. Today, it's still that way for the Republican Party for the most part. For the Democratic Party, they've got a proportional method. So what's the difference? So if you see this graphic, the winner-take-all method means that if a candidate wins 40% of the vote, they don't get any delegates. The one that got the most votes gets those delegates. So 60% of the vote gets 100% of those delegates. With a proportional system, if you win 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the delegates. If your state has 100 delegates, that means you get 40 of them. So you get something out of the deal. Sure, you would have loved to have won, but it's not like you're walking away empty-handed. So as far as an evaluation of the primary, there's pros and cons. One of the biggest cons, at least in Mr. Hill's personal opinion, is it can get tiring hearing about election, primary, vote, candidate. And, it can be exhausting, especially for folks who don't otherwise care. Now, I'm a nerd, and I like this kind of thing. But even I get kind of sick of all of it. Because it seems like we have these elections all the time, always. It's not like that in other countries. In other countries, they have a election cycle that doesn't last more than a month. We have a cycle that can be argued lasts all the time. Like at the end of 2016, there was like 2 months. And then 2017 hit, and people started actively campaigning for president for this year. That was 4 years ago. So it can be kind of tiring. Having said that, the primary is still a pretty good tool because it forces potential nominees to test their political strength and prove their worthiness as main contenders. If you don't manage to finish in the top 2 or 3 of that primary, then you probably shouldn't have gotten in the first place. Now, that's not to say that you can't be a good president or a good candidate. It just might not be your year. You might not have a ton of experience. Give you a great example from this year. Recently, you had Pete Buttigieg, who was running for the Democratic Party nomination. Super young. He's 37 or 8. Regardless, if he had won the nomination and then gone on to beat Trump in November, he would have been the youngest president ever. But he had only ever been the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which South Bend, Indiana is basically 3 Tupelos big. So it's not even a huge city. And that's the most experience that he actually has. That probably didn't play in his favor as far as, experience and things like that. Primaries also make the nomination process more democratic because the voters actually have a say in who gets to be their nominee, who gets to be their candidate. Primaries are less important to the party in power, which will typically either nominate the sitting president, which is the case this year. Donald Trump has another term of eligibility remaining. The Republicans have basically all rallied around Trump. Or they'll nominate a candidate endorsed by the president. So if you go back to 2016, President Obama didn't come right out immediately and endorse Hillary Clinton, but everybody kind of knew that Obama liked Hillary Clinton because she had been his Secretary of State. There were just lots of connections there, and she was the de facto nominee, even though Bernie Sanders put up quite a fight back in 2016. Now, there have been lots of primary reform proposals. Critics suggest that a series of regional primaries or even a single national primary would be more efficient than the long, costly state-by-state primary system. And there's a lot that can be said about having a national primary day. It would be really cool to have just a national primary election day, and at the end of that day, we all know who each party's nominee is going to be. You don't have to stretch it out from February to basically July and oh my gosh, who's it going to be? Is it going to be my guy? Is it going to be that gal? Who is it going to be? You would know at the end of that day. So you can definitely see some arguments for that, but it's up to each individual state. Each individual state would have to sign off on this, and obviously that would be really difficult, to put into practice. Now, as far as caucuses are not common. Off the top of my head, 7, I think, states still hold caucuses. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. Mississippi is not one of them. In the states that do not hold primaries, caucuses choose the delegates to a national convention. Party voters go to a local caucus where they vote for delegates to attend a district convention, and then they go into a state convention, and then they go into the national convention. So it's like levels up. The Iowa caucuses generally get the most attention because they are the first delegate selection event held in any presidential election season. So if you go back this year, early February, I want to say February 3rd maybe, the Iowa caucuses were held. It was the first event of this presidential election year. And that's largely Iowa's claim to fame, because otherwise it's just flat bunch of corn and windmills and whatever. Who knows? At the national convention, like I've already kind of alluded to, the party nominee is usually known well before the national convention. Today, 2020, we're in May right now. The national conventions are going to be in like August for both parties, and they're still going to have them. They're currently debating whether or not to have virtual conventions due to the COVID pandemic. But I mean, we already know who it's going to be. For the Republicans, it's Trump, because he's a sitting incumbent president with another term of eligibility. And for the Democrats, it's going to be Vice President Joe Biden, who is the last one standing after all those folks have already dropped out. Conventions have 3 goals: naming the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates, number 1. And even though we're already going to know, you got to make it official. Uniting the party's factions and leaders in one place for a common purpose. That's really important, because when you think about both the Republican and Democratic parties today, we just have 2 parties for a super diverse body of voters. Not all Republicans think the same. Not all Democrats think the same. You might have, I don't know, pro-gay marriage Republicans and anti-abortion Democrats. Just because you have one or the other label doesn't mean you automatically believe in everything that most of the party stands for. So you got these little groups within each party. So you got to bridge those divides. You got to bring the party together as a team that are all wearing the same jersey, so that you can beat the other guys, because that's what you really want at the end of the day, is power. The Republicans may or may not even like Trump, but they do like winning. So they definitely want to beat Joe Biden coming up this November. And it's the same story for the Democrats. The Democrats, at least probably half of them, don't like Joe Biden that much, but they definitely don't like Trump. Even they don't like him even more than they don't like, Joe Biden. So they're probably going to rally around Biden to try to beat Trump this coming November. The third goal is to adopt the party platform. And the party platform is basically just, where does the party stand on a variety of different issues and topics? What are the policy goals and objectives for the campaign? This would be things like, I don't know, if your party stands for like traditional marriage, or if your party is pro-choice, or if your party is, for more immigration or stronger, gun control, whatever it happens to be. It's just that list of policy proposals that each party kind of comes up with. So if you say, well, I'm a Democrat, folks can probably assume you're for so many things. If you come out and say, I'm a Republican, folks can say you're for so many things as well. Conventions also draw a lot of media attention for the party and its candidate. It's going to be really interesting this year, because if we're talking about a virtual convention, how does that actually look? If it winds up working like the NFL draft did, last month, then it might actually come off pretty awesomely. If memory serves, this most recent NFL draft was the most watched draft in recent memory. So who knows? It might work. It might not work as well. Who can say? Conventions usually meet for around 3 to 4 days. They're organized around speeches delivered by party leaders. You got a keynote speaker. The thing about the keynote speaker, and I'll point this out very quickly. Usually, this keynote address, it's like the kind of opening address. It's like one of those main event things during the convention. The parties will usually give that keynote speech to an up-and-coming star in the party. So here's your great example of this. If you go back to the 2004 Democratic National Convention, they gave the keynote speech to a young, first-time, senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. And he gives this speech, and everybody loves the speech, and they think, man, that guy's got something. And then he goes on the next cycle to win the Democratic nomination and go on to become president. So if you're watching these conventions, if you're a nerd like me, pay attention to who these keynote speakers are, because that can give you a preview as to who might be the candidates in future presidential cycles. So obviously, when you think about the race for the presidency, it begins long before the actual election. I'm channeling my Coach Matthews here. So when you think about, like I already mentioned before, this race for 2020 started in like January of 2017. It's been going on for a long time. Between 1 and 4 years before the election, potential candidates begin to explore their options, explore their chances, getting together exploratory committees, which is often code for I am running for president. They get organized, they raise money, they start building up, ground support, which is basically boots on the ground in different states, especially the swing states that are going to be very important in the election. Get an organization there to have people, knock on doors or, text or call potential voters, getting voter registration drives, whatever it happens to be. From January to June of the election year, primaries and caucuses help decide the party's front runner, which we've already kind of explained. We would be kind of toward the end of the primary season. I guess we still technically are, but we already know right now it's Trump for the Republicans, it's Joe Biden for the Democrats. In August and September, the parties hold their conventions and adopt their platforms and officially nominate their candidates. From September to November, the presidential candidates will hold debates and give speeches. You're going to have at least 3 presidential debates. Usually cities and colleges and universities will bid to host presidential debates. Another kind of neat thing, if you go back to the 2008 campaign, University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, was the host of the first presidential debate in that cycle between Obama and McCain. On the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, the voters cast their ballots and choose the president-elect. And then you have this kind of window between November and January of the next year. And that's when you have like the transition and, starting to, move people out, move people in to the White House, that kind of thing. So who's actually nominated? So sitting presidents eligible for another term are usually nominated. So again, great example right now, you've got Donald Trump, who is eligible for another term. He's basically automatically nominated for this year. Nominees have almost always held elected offices, with governors being the most common nominees. Now, even though that's the most common, that's not a requirement. Again, we'll go to Donald Trump. He had never been elected to anything before 2016, and yet he comes right out of the gate, runs for president, and wins. You can have generals from the military who have gone on to become president. You think about like Ulysses S. Grant or Dwight Eisenhower. But normally, usually, you have some elected experience, and especially with governors, especially governors of large populous states, that's usually who winds up winning these nominations. You think about Ronald Reagan, he was the governor of California. Think about George W. Bush, he was the governor of Texas. You think about any of the presidents that have come from like Ohio or Virginia. Now, those folks were either governors or senators or, folks like that. Long public record is common, but again, not a necessity. All you have to do is point at Trump again. He doesn't have a long record of he voted this way on anything because he had never had elected office before. Meanwhile, you think about, again, go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton had been in Bill Clinton's White House. Obviously, she was the first lady, during the 90s. She served as a senator for the state of New York. She was Obama's Secretary of State. She had lots of voting track record that people could point to and say, oh, well, when you're president, you'll probably support XYZ thing because you voted XYZ way when you were a senator. The overwhelming majority of nominees have been white, male, Protestant, and married. So, again, there are exceptions to any of these things. So, for instance, you think about most of them have been white. I mean, it's still true, but you have Obama. Obama's the first African American president. Male, to this point, we have had only male presidents. That is going to change at some point. It came real close to changing in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won nearly 3 million more votes than Trump did, but lost the Electoral College. There's going to be a woman president someday, probably sooner rather than later. As far as Protestant, that's a religious kind of preference. We have had one Catholic president, JFK. All other presidents have been some flavor of Protestant Christianity. Most have been married. Off the top of my head, we've had one bachelor president, which was James Buchanan. If you go back to the antebellum period before the Civil War, you had Grover Cleveland in the 1880s, who was a bachelor when he was elected, but then actually is the only president we've ever had that got married while in the White House. Women and minorities had not been serious party candidates until 2008. When you had Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama going for the Democratic nomination. Obama won the nom, and then he won the White House as well. And then you go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton won the nomination and came just about 11,000 votes short of winning the Electoral College. Republican nominee John McCain was the oldest major party presidential candidate in history until 2016, when Donald Trump won the White House at 70 years old. And that's it for section 4. Next video coming up, we'll talk about the presidential election itself, which we'll see this coming fall during class. So check out the next video.